Carl Gustav Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist who spent most of his professional life working on a question that most scientists considered unanswerable, and most theologians had already settled. He was not satisfied with either position. He built towers with his own hands. He collected stones. He held extended conversations with figures that appeared in his own imagination, and he took notes on what they said. The problem that organized his entire career was among the oldest in human thought. What is the self? Not what is the brain. Not what is personality in the sense of a profile or a classification. What is the self? The thing that lives beneath the version of a person the world sees. The voice that speaks in dreams. The part that feels ancient even in youth. The thread connecting private interior life to myths told by people dead 10,000 years. That was the question, and Jung spent 85 years in pursuit of it. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in the Swiss village of Keswil, on the shore of Lake Constance in northern Switzerland. His father was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church. His mother came from a long line of pastors and theologians. Her father was a prominent clergyman in Basel. Her grandfather, a Hebraist who had devoted his career to ancient Hebrew scripture. And there was more to that background than simple piety. Religion in Jung's household was not a set of beliefs held at arm's length. It was the framework through which everything was interpreted. That matters considerably. Jung grew up watching faith under visible strain. His father, Paul Jung, was a kind and learned man who began teaching his son Latin at the age of 4. But his father's belief was eroding, in a way the young Carl could observe directly. The sermons sometimes carried a hollow quality, as if the words had become detached from conviction, as if the God Paul Jung had been trained to proclaim had become distant and abstract. Jung watched his father recite a language he no longer fully trusted. That image stayed with him permanently. His mother, Emily Jung, was a more complicated figure. She was warm in some periods and absent in others. When Carl was 3 years old, she spent time away from the household, some form of breakdown or illness whose nature was never fully documented. That early absence left a lasting mark. Jung later wrote that he had experienced his mother as two people, the ordinary Swiss woman who ran the household, and another version, stranger, less predictable, that emerged at night. He took this seriously, not as a metaphor, but as a clinical observation. A single person containing more than one self. He noted the same division in himself. He called his two inner versions number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was the schoolboy, practical, socially functional, prone to daydreaming, weak in mathematics. But number 2 was something else entirely. Older, quieter, connected to stone and silence, possessing a quality he could only describe as ancient. When he walked in the hills above the village or sat beside the lake, something in him felt as though it had always existed and would always continue to. He had no explanation for it. He simply registered it. And then there were the visions. When he was approximately 11 years old, sitting on a wall in the schoolyard one afternoon, a thought arrived, not from inside but from somewhere external. It concerned God, seated on a golden throne above the Basel Cathedral. What came next, Jung said. He fought for 3 days. He described the effort as genuine anguish. Completing the thought felt like something that could destroy him. He completed it. God on the golden throne, defecated on the cathedral. The roof shattered. The church was broken open from above. That image, which might easily have produced a crisis of faith, produced the opposite. After sitting with it, turning it over, Jung concluded it had not been a sin. It had been something placed in him deliberately, placed precisely because he had been willing to think it. The breaking of the cathedral from above was not sacrilege. It was revelation. The true sacred was larger and stranger than any institution's claim to contain it. That conviction would run through everything he did, for the rest of his life. As he grew older, Jung read Schopenhauer, Goethe, and the pre-Socratics, and found in them what religious instruction had never provided: the sense that serious thinkers were actually grappling with the deep questions, rather than reciting approved answers. The family was not wealthy. His father's village pastorship was modest. Financial constraint was a persistent background condition. Jung was aware of this, and it sharpened his ambition. He considered archaeology, then philosophy, then natural science. A powerful dream about digging up prehistoric animal bones felt like a directional signal. He eventually settled on medicine, partly for pragmatic reasons. What pulled him, though, was not medicine in the ordinary sense. It was the strange cases, patients who spoke in riddles, who heard voices, who inhabited the world in ways their contemporaries could not follow. His doctoral dissertation, completed in 1902, was based on a series of séances held with his young cousin Helene Preiswerk, who claimed to channel spirits. Most scholars dismissed the material as superstition. Jung did not because he accepted the spirits as literally present, but because the psychological phenomena were real. Something genuine was occurring in Helene's mind, and it was worth investigating. He took a position at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, working under Eugen Bleuler, the same Bleuler who coined the term schizophrenia. Bleuler assigned him to work on the word association test. The design was simple. A researcher read a word to a subject who responded immediately with the first word that came to mind. But the pauses were the significant element. When a particular word produced an unexpected delay, a strange response, or a visible physical reaction, something below conscious awareness had grabbed it. Jung called these clusters of charged associations complexes, not in the casual modern sense, but as a precise technical observation, fragments of the psyche operating below awareness, distorting responses without the subject's knowledge. In 1906, Jung sent a copy of his word association findings to Sigmund Freud in Vienna. Freud wrote back. The following year, Jung traveled to meet him. They shook hands in Freud's apartment and began talking. They did not stop for 13 hours. Two minds that had been working toward the same territory from different directions, finding each other for the first time. Freud was 19 years older, established within the small world of psychoanalysis, the author of The Interpretation of Dreams. He needed something urgently, a successor who was not Jewish, who could extend psychoanalysis beyond the Viennese Jewish intellectual world where it had originated. He looked at Jung and saw that person. He called Jung his crown prince, his Joshua, the one fated to enter the promised land Freud himself would not reach. Jung needed something in return, a father figure who took the interior life seriously, who had done real scientific work on the unconscious. In Freud, he found exactly that. For 5 years they were intellectually inseparable. They traveled together to America in 1909. They exchanged 360 letters. They analyzed each other's dreams. But the disagreement that would eventually end the relationship was present from early on. Freud maintained, with increasing rigidity, that the primary driver of the unconscious was sexuality. He was not open to debate on this. He told Jung more than once that the sexual theory must be held as dogma, an unshakable bulwark against the tide of occultism. That word, dogma, lodged in Jung like a splinter. He had grown up watching his father recite religious dogma that had drained of meaning. He had spent his young intellectual life rejecting the idea that truth came from authority rather than inquiry. And here was Freud, brilliant, searching, asking him to accept a foundational claim without question. The disagreement was substantive as well. Jung believed the energy animating the unconscious was not primarily sexual. He used the word libido, but meant something far broader. A general psychic energy, a life force with many possible expressions. Sexuality was one expression of something deeper, but not the whole architecture. By the end of 1912, when Jung published Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, which took direct aim at Freud's foundations, the fracture was complete. In January 1913, Freud sent a letter ending the relationship. It accused Jung, in plain terms, of being mentally unwell. Jung recorded his response in his diary. The rest is silence. He was 38 years old. He resigned from the International Psychoanalytic Association. Colleagues who had followed Freud's lead turned cold. And in the winter of 1913, alone in a way he had not been since childhood, something in his mind gave way. And this is where things get genuinely strange. Not strange in the way people use the word loosely. Strange in the way that makes you stop and sit with it for a moment. It started with visions on a train. He was traveling, returning home, fully awake, and he saw Europe flooded with blood, rivers of it, cities drowning, thousands dead, yellow waves and the wreckage of civilization. The vision arrived not as a thought, but as something that had seized him from the outside. He thought he was losing his mind. The visions continued, at night, in early morning, in unguarded intervals during the day. A bird girl speaking in riddles. A wise old man with kingfisher wings and the horns of a bull. Enormous and luminous, possessing the quality of something that had simply always existed. Jung later said he had feared he was developing schizophrenia. Those were his words. He was genuinely uncertain whether what was happening was the onset of madness, or something that needed to be followed rather than suppressed. He made a decision. He would not run. He would go in. Beginning in the winter of 1913, Jung conducted a deliberate experiment on himself. Each evening, in a specific chair in his study, he allowed his mind to descend into what he called active imagination. He would picture himself standing at the edge of an inner landscape, a cliff, a doorway, a depth, and drop into it. He would watch, he would listen, and he took notes in a series of black notebooks on everything he encountered. What he met were not vague impressions. They were distinct, named, recurring presences. One figure he first recognized as the biblical Elijah, a prophet with a serene and slightly alarming certainty, who over time developed into someone Jung called Philemon. Philemon had the wings of a kingfisher. He walked with Jung in the garden and said things Jung had not thought of himself. He offered perspectives that surprised the man encountering them. And there was a conclusion Jung drew from this that would pivot everything in his subsequent work. Philemon was not Jung making up wise-sounding material to tell himself. He was something the unconscious had produced autonomously, a presence with its own agency, functioning independently of conscious intention. He also encountered a female voice, a figure he would later identify as the Anima, that argued his explorations were merely art. He insisted they were science. The voice replied, "And is that not art?" He had no answer. The visions of flood and burning that had seemed like symptoms of collapse found an external counterpart in August 1914, when the First World War began. Europe had been moving toward that war for years. Most people pushed the sense of it away. something in Jung's mind had not. He recorded everything, first in the black notebooks. Then, beginning around 1914, he began transferring the material into a larger volume, handwritten in calligraphic script with full-page illustrations painted in vivid color. He worked on it for 16 years. He had it bound in red leather, so large and heavy it weighed nearly 10 pounds. He called it Liber Novus. The world came to know it as the Red Book. He later said it was the most important work he ever produced. He locked it in a Swiss bank vault and never published it during his lifetime. Out of those years of descent came the central concepts, the ideas that would reshape how psychology understood the interior of the human mind. The most fundamental was the idea that separated him most completely from Freud. Below the personal unconscious, the layer of individual repressions and complexes that Freud had mapped, Jung proposed there was another layer entirely, older, shared, not individual at all. He called it the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is not the contents of a particular life pushed out of awareness. It is a far older structure, an inherited psychological substrate carrying the accumulated symbolic and emotional experience of the entire human species. Not as specific memories, but as patterns, templates, predispositions towards certain images, stories, and emotional responses. He arrived at this from two directions simultaneously. His own visions during active imagination had produced figures, Philemon, Salome, the wise old man, that he recognized in texts he subsequently encountered, ancient Egyptian mythology, Gnostic manuscripts, the dreams of patients who had never read those traditions, cultures that had never intersected with each other, separated by thousands of years. The emotional weight of the figures was identical across all of them. The images had not been borrowed. They had been discovered, independently, repeatedly. Jung's term for the generative structure behind those recurring images was archetype, not the specific images themselves, but the templates that produced them across cultures. The wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, the shadow. These were not inventions. They were discoveries, and he spent the next 4 decades mapping them. The shadow archetype produced the most direct practical application. Jung defined the shadow as the unknown dark side of the personality. Not evil necessarily, but unacknowledged. The anger suppressed as unacceptable. The ambitions set aside as not respectable. The grief never permitted to surface. The shadow does not disappear when ignored. It goes underground and surfaces in other ways, in sudden overreactions, in inexplicable hostility toward people who express what the observer has rejected in themselves. At a larger scale, it becomes the mechanism of collective hatred, the projection of a society's unowned darkness onto a designated group, because that darkness cannot be tolerated as something internal. The persona occupied the opposite end of the same problem. It is the mask, the professional identity, the social face, the maintained image, functional and necessary in ordinary life, but dangerous when confused with the face beneath it. Most patients who came to Jung in their 40s were suffering from exactly this. The persona had succeeded, the outer life was objectively secure, and the emptiness was equally real. He called it the second half of life problem, not a trivial crisis of vanity, but a psychological emergency, the deeper self demanding to be recognized. The Anima and Animus were among the most complex and debated archetypes in the system. In a man, the anima represents the unconscious feminine dimension, the emotional, receptive, feeling capacities that tend to be suppressed in men socialized away from them. In a woman, the animus represents the corresponding inner masculine. When these dimensions go unacknowledged, they tend to get projected outward. A man who has not engaged his anima projects it onto actual women, which accounts for the almost supernatural intensity some attachments carry at their start. It is not the other person being encountered at that level. It is the man's own interior life reflected back. Jung had direct and complicated personal experience with this. He married Emma Rauschenbach in 1903, and the marriage lasted until Emma's death in 1955. But Jung also developed a long and significant relationship with Tony Wolff, a former patient who became a colleague and major intellectual partner during his most productive years. Emma was aware of the arrangement. She was not undisturbed by it. Jung never claimed to have lived up to his own articulated ideals. He acknowledged the distance between understanding something intellectually and actually living it. That distance, he wrote, was enormous. When Jung mapped the structure of the psyche, he was attempting something nobody had fully tried before: to make the interior as concrete and navigable as the exterior world. Freud had done part of this work. He had given the unconscious a grammar, the language of repression, wish, and drive. But Freud's unconscious was, in its essential structure, a personal place. It was made of your specific childhood, your particular repressions, your individual traumas. Jung accepted the reality of the personal unconscious. His insistence, and this was the crux of the disagreement, was that the personal layer was only the outermost stratum. He described the full structure in geological terms. At the surface, the ego, the conscious self, the organizing intelligence that manages daily functioning. Just below it, the persona, the constructed social face. Below that, the personal unconscious, the repressed material, the complexes, the emotional residue of individual experience. And below all of that, something vast and impersonal, the collective unconscious. The key distinction is this: not inherited memories. No one carries specific stories or images from their ancestors in any literal sense, but inherited predispositions, the capacity to form certain kinds of images, certain emotional shapes. The archetype is not the image itself, but the mold that generates the image across cultures and centuries. The archetype of the Great Mother is not any specific goddess. It is the emotional template that has produced Isis, Mary, Kuan Yin, Demeter, and the Black Madonna, across civilizations that never communicated with one another. The template preceded all the specific forms. The cultural expressions came after. This is the explanation for why the same story keeps being told. The hero descends into the underworld and returns. The trickster overturns the established order and sometimes saves it in the process. The wise guide appears at the moment of greatest confusion. The monster turns out to be wearing a recognizable face. These are not stories cultures invented. They are stories cultures discovered, drawn from the same deep structure that every culture serious about the inner life has independently accessed. Now here is the part I find genuinely astonishing. When Jung was working at the Burg Hölzli, before any of this had a name, he had a patient, severely schizophrenic, almost entirely withdrawn from ordinary reality, who one afternoon guided him to a window and asked him to observe the sun. The patient told him that if one looked carefully, one could see a tube hanging from the sun, and that moving one's head back and forth would cause the tube to move and generate wind. Jung noted the observation and moved on. Several years later, reading an obscure text from the ancient Greek Mithraic mysteries, a tradition that had vanished 15 centuries earlier, he found a ritual instruction. A priest was told to look at the sun and behold a tube hanging from it, and that moving the head would produce the wind. The schizophrenic patient had never encountered the Mithraic liturgy. Nobody was teaching it in Swiss psychiatric hospitals in the early 20th century. The correspondence was nearly word for word. What Jung understood in that moment was the mechanism. The schizophrenic mind, which had lost the mediating structure of the ego, was receiving transmissions from the collective layer without any filter, without the organizing container that makes such material bearable. The illness was not the presence of the material. It was the failure of the container. The word association test was simpler in design than its implications would prove to be. A researcher sat across from a subject and read a list of words, one at a time. The subject was instructed to respond immediately with the first word that came to mind. No deliberation, no hesitation. Jung timed the responses with a stopwatch and noted physiological reactions, changes in breathing, skin conductance, and posture. He catalogued the anomalies. What mattered was that the anomalies clustered. The same person who hesitated on the word knife would also respond unusually to the word blood, the word mother, the word hospital. The hesitations formed a constellation, a pattern pointing, when followed carefully enough, toward a specific emotional wound, even when the subject had no conscious connection to it. The practical consequence was direct. Simply asking someone to describe what troubled them could not produce the full account. The most important material was precisely what they had no conscious access to. It had to be found obliquely, through the pattern of hesitations, through the constellations of charged associations that only became visible when one stepped back and looked at the data as a whole. This gave Jung what Freud had been arguing without empirical backing: evidence in the form of measurable reaction times, that the unconscious was real, that it had content, and that it was actively shaping behavior. He sent the results to Freud in 1906. Freud's reply was immediate and enthusiastic. Here was data. Here was the confirmation that clinical observation alone could not provide. That exchange was the beginning of the relationship. In 1923, the year his mother died, Jung bought a piece of land on the shore of the upper lake of Zurich at a place called Bollingen. He started with a simple round tower. Rough stone, no electricity, no running water. He built it largely with his own hands. Over the following decades he added to it, room by room and wing by wing, as his inner life extended. The whole structure eventually functioned as a kind of three-dimensional map of his psychology. He cooked over an open fire. He drew water from a well. He sat in silence for extended periods. He carved stone. On his 75th birthday, he inscribed a large stone cube. 3 faces, each carrying a different text, one in Greek, one in Latin, one bearing an alchemical inscription. He said he was writing something for himself, for the stone, for no audience. Just the act of cutting letters into rock with the intention that they would outlast him. He wrote later that Bollingen was where he was most himself. That there, in the silence beside the lake, he was the age-old son of the mother. The number 2 of his childhood. The ancient one who had always been more at home in quiet than in company. The tower grew through losses. He added to it after his mother's death. He added another extension after Emma died in November 1955. Emma, who had been his partner for 52 years, and whose own scholarly work on the Grail legend stood on its own merits. In the final days before his death, he dreamed of a great white stone. After the Red Book years, after the confrontation with the unconscious that ran from roughly 1913 into the early 1920s, Jung emerged with his ideas in formation and began the second major phase of his work: documentation, the effort to show that what he had found in himself was not personal, but universal. Individuation was the word he placed at the center of all of this. Not individualism, he was explicit about the distinction. Individuation is the process of becoming more fully what one actually is, integrating the shadow, engaging the anima or animus, moving beyond the persona. It is not a destination, it is a practice. And he saw this process reflected across fairy tales, mythology, and, most unexpectedly, alchemy. Jung became absorbed with alchemy in the late 1920s and remained so for the rest of his working life. Not because he believed in the literal transmutation of metals. He recognized that what the alchemists were documenting, under heavily coded chemical language they barely understood themselves, was the transformation of the psyche. The prima materia, the raw, unprocessed starting material, was the unconscious. The nigrido, the blackening stage, was the confrontation with the shadow. The albedo was the first integration. The rubedo, the reddening, the final stage, corresponded to individuation. And the philosopher's stone, the object of the entire labor, was the self. Medieval European alchemists, working in isolation, had been mapping the interior journey all along. Nobody had made the connection before Jung. Synchronicity occupied him across these same years. He had been thinking about it since the late 1920s, working through cases his patients described and experiences of his own. Moments when an inner psychological event and an outer physical event mirrored each other in a way that ordinary causation could not account for. A patient had been dreaming about a golden scarab beetle. The following morning, describing the dream in session, a real scarab, a rare species for that region of Switzerland, tapped at Jung's office window. The events were not causally connected. The correspondence was exact. Jung called this an acausal connecting principle, a form of meaningful connection between events that was real even though it operated outside the logic of cause and effect. His colleague Wolfgang Pauli, one of the central figures in quantum mechanics, took the idea seriously enough to co-author a book on the subject. Working at the edge of physics where the standard rules of causation began to dissolve, Pauli recognized that Jung was pointing towards something the hard sciences had not yet found language for. What set Jung apart from nearly every other major figure in early psychology was his sustained commitment to working outside Europe. Freud never seriously left Vienna. His understanding of psychology, for all its power, was constructed from a narrow sample, educated, largely bourgeois, concentrated in Central European cities. His world was the consulting room and the coffee house. Jung left. He went to America in 1909 and again in 1924. He went to East Africa in 1925, spending months in Kenya and Uganda, living roughly by his usual standards, sitting with tribal elders, attending ceremonies, listening. He went to India in 1937, traveling through Calcutta, Allahabad, Madras, and Mysore, moving through Hindu temples, Buddhist sites, and ashrams whose contemplative traditions stretched back thousands of years. In each place, he found the same deep structure wearing different cultural clothes. The African initiation ceremonies, the ritual death and rebirth of the young man, his emergence as a new person, were structurally identical to what medieval alchemists had called the transformation of the prima materia, identical in structure to what many of his patients were undergoing in the consultation room in Kusnacht, in their dreams and crises and gradual, sometimes painful emergences into a more complete sense of themselves. The outer forms were culturally specific. The underlying shape was shared. It belonged to no single tradition. It belonged, in Jung's view, to the species. At the Taos Pueblo in 1924, an elder named Mountain Lake told him that white people always seemed nervous and uneasy, always seeking, always disturbing things. White people, he said, lived in their heads. They were cut off from the sun, the land, the sky. They were partial, truncated. Jung received this without defensiveness. He heard it as a precise clinical observation made from outside his own cultural assumptions about a collective condition he had been working to name: the overvaluation of reason, the abandonment of ritual, the disconnection from the natural world, the replacement of meaning with mechanism. He called the conversation one of the most illuminating of his life. In 1952, at 77 years old, in uncertain health after a series of serious illnesses, Jung published a book that unsettled many religious readers and clarified something for many others. It was called Answer to Job. By his own account, it was written in a concentrated 2-week period, what he described as an inspired fever. He said afterward that he had to write it. In the same way, the confrontation with the unconscious had simply had to be undergone. The book is an extended psychological commentary on the Book of Job, and what Jung argues directly, without academic hedging, is that God, as depicted in the Job narrative, behaves in morally questionable ways. The God who permits Satan to destroy his most faithful servant on the basis of a wager is not, in psychological terms, a God who is fully conscious. He possesses enormous power and genuine darkness, without awareness of either. What occurs through the incarnation of Christ, the entry of the divine into human suffering, is, in Jung's reading, God's attempt to confront his own shadow, to become aware, to integrate what the confrontation with Job had forced into visibility. This was not a comfortable book for Orthodox believers, but the record shows something equally important. It was also not an atheist book. Jung was not dismissing God or religion. He was taking them more seriously than most theology permitted. He was asking a question theology had generally declined to ask directly. What is the moral character of the God the tradition has described? He was 77. He had earned the standing to ask the uncomfortable questions. He had been asking them since he was 11. In 1944, Jung broke his foot. A week later, a heart attack followed. He remained on the border of death for weeks. What he experienced during that time, he described in memories, dreams, reflections with considerable care and an explicit acknowledgement that he found it difficult to speak about at all. He had, he said, visions during the illness. He found himself floating above the earth, in space, looking down at the entire planet from a great height. He could see the whole globe below, wrapped in blue light. He was moving toward what he described as a dark rock temple suspended in space, and he knew that inside the temple were the answers to what his life had been about. But before he could enter, a figure appeared, his doctor risen into the same cosmic space, and told him to go back, that he was needed, that it was not time. He was, by his own account, deeply disappointed. Returning to ordinary consciousness, back in the hospital, back in the familiar world. Everything around him felt flat and without content for weeks. He also said he knew, with a certainty he could not account for, that the doctor who had turned him back would die soon. 3 weeks later, the doctor did. Jung never claimed certainty about what the experience was. He did not present it as proof of life after death. What he said was that it had felt more real than anything he had encountered in ordinary waking life, more vivid, more substantial, and that whatever its ultimate nature, a genuine transpersonal experience or an extraordinary production of a brain at the edge of failure, it had changed something in him permanently. He was not without serious failures, and the most historically consequential concerned his conduct during the rise of National Socialism in Germany. In 1933, Jung accepted the editorship of a German psychological journal after Jewish colleagues had been forced out of their positions. In 1934, he wrote suggesting meaningful psychological differences between Jewish and Aryan psychology, a claim he partially retracted later, but one that, read against the context of what was then happening in Germany, functions as accommodation at best. His defenders have framed this as naivety in a catastrophic political situation. His critics have argued something harder, that a man who had spent his career studying the shadow, who understood better than almost anyone alive what happens when collective darkness is projected onto a designated group, should have seen it more plainly and said so without hesitation. The full record is more complicated than either position allows. He did help Jewish colleagues escape Nazi Germany. He did eventually resign from positions connected to the regime. He did condemn the Nazis explicitly after the war. What he said about his own conduct during those years was brief and measured. He acknowledged mistakes. He did not elaborate. Whether that reticence reflects wisdom or evasion, the record leaves open. The personal failures were also real. He wrote about the gap between his articulated ideals and the life he managed to live, with something approaching candor. He said directly that no one should take his writing as a model for behavior. He was documenting an inner journey, not a completed life. The Red Book remained locked in a vault for nearly 50 years after his death. He had worked on it for 16 years and then stopped, not because it was finished, but because he had extracted from it what he needed. The paintings, calligraphy, and strange medieval prose were too raw and too personal for publication. His family honored that judgment. The book was finally published in 2009, and the response from those who encountered it was consistent. It was unlike anything else in the history of psychology. Part illuminated manuscript, part field notes from the interior, part visionary text. Not a book one reads so much as a document one encounters. Jung had said it was his most important work, and that saying so would make people think him mad. Both things were true. Jung was direct about the position his work occupied relative to the scientific mainstream, and that position deserves honest description. The collective unconscious cannot be observed directly. The archetypes are inferred, not measured. Synchronicity has never been tested in a controlled experiment meeting standard empirical requirements. Many of his central ideas are, in the strict philosophical sense, unfalsifiable, which means that by one major framework for what counts as science, they do not qualify. Jung understood this, but he ultimately refused to reduce the psyche to what existing instruments could measure. He argued that empirical science, despite its extraordinary productivity, had produced a particular blind spot, the inability to take seriously anything that did not fit its methods, and that this blind spot had consequences, the aspects of experience that scientific instruments could not address, meaning value, the interior life, the sense of the sacred, did not disappear simply because they resisted measurement. They went unaddressed. And unaddressed, they caused damage. His was not an anti-scientific position. It was a position about domain. The scientific method is extraordinarily powerful within its domain, and it has a domain. The interior of the human psyche extends, in his view, beyond that domain in ways that remain incompletely mapped. That argument is unresolved. It remains active. In his final years, Jung continued to see patients and to write. His correspondence alone, with theologians, scientists, artists, and ordinary people who had encountered his books and wanted to share their own experiences. was substantial. He took it seriously. He replied, often at considerable length. He walked in his garden. He sailed on the lake when his health permitted. He spent time with his grandchildren, who remembered a man who was warm and quiet, and sometimes inwardly preoccupied, as if part of him was always attending to something they could not hear. Emma died in November 1955. They had been together for 52 years. Her death left him, by multiple accounts, genuinely bereft. He added another room to the Bollingen Tower after she died. He said it signified an extension of consciousness achieved only in old age. In the months before his death in June 1961, he was still working on the essay that would become Man and His Symbols, the introduction to his thought intended for a general audience. He had dreamed the night before a colleague asked him to write such a book, that he was speaking to a large crowd of people who understood him. He took that as direction. He finished his section of the book. He died before it was published. The storm that came over the house at Kusnacht in the hours after his death, the lightning that struck and split the tree he had sat beneath in the garden, was noted by those present. He would have noted it too. Not as proof, as a rhyme. The kind of correspondence the world occasionally offers, without explanation, at the close of a life. More than 60 years after his death, the ideas are as active as they have been at any point. Possibly more so, because the institutional structures he was working against have softened enough to allow them circulation. The language of the shadow is now in common use. In therapy offices, in writing about leadership, in public discussions of collective responsibility that would not have been possible a generation ago. When a culture begins examining its own history of violence and denial, it is, in Jungian terms, beginning shadow work. The outcome is not guaranteed. Shadow work on an individual level can go badly, can collapse into self-recrimination or into the projection of darkness onto new targets. The same is true collectively. But beginning it, acknowledging that the shadow exists, is a start the earlier century did not have available in these terms. The archetype concept has become the substrate of modern storytelling, in ways most storytellers do not consciously trace back to him. Joseph Campbell spent his career translating Jung's archetype theory into the language of comparative mythology. The hero with 1,000 faces became the structural foundation of a significant portion of modern storytelling. Star Wars, The Lion King, The Matrix. The scaffolding is Jungian, whether the writers recognized it or not. His contribution to how people understand the second half of life may be the most practically significant legacy of all. The idea that midlife is not a decline from earlier achievements, but a completely different project, one requiring inner work rather than outer accumulation, was largely absent from Western thought before him. The question of individuation, what it means to become more fully oneself rather than more successfully conforming to what culture, family, and profession require, is one of the genuinely consequential questions in psychology. Jung took it more seriously than anyone else in the history of the Western tradition. The work he did toward answering it, however incomplete, however contested, however unorthodox, has not been superseded. It has been extended, argued with, applied in directions he never anticipated. But the core insight remains: that the self is larger than the ego, that the unconscious is not the enemy of the self, but its depth, and that the work of a human life includes becoming more fully what one already is. He spent 85 years with a problem that does not fully solve: the mystery of what a human being is, the depth beneath the surface, the ancient thing that speaks in dreams. He left behind a body of work that is still, for many thousands of people, the most useful map they have of the interior. Not a finished map, not a complete one. A living map, still being added to, still being argued over, still leading people into territory they did not know was there. That seems right, for a man who spent his life insisting that the interior was inexhaustible.